I'm Anna.
And I'm Katie.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about Skinner.
So a little bit about his early life. Skinner was born in Pennsylvania. It is said that he was raised in a stable home with a stay-at-home mom. He, at a young age, showed a lot of interest in like building things, like a lot of hands-on things. And some of this was like a cart with like backward steering, perpetual motion machine, stuff like that.
And he had a brother too, right? So I bet that was fun. Like
he did
to work with a brother. He probably got into a lot of trouble doing stuff like that.
Yeah, and he also dreamed of becoming a writer.
Education was probably really important in his household. His dad was a lawyer, and so it probably kind of inspired his dream for higher education. He actually got a bachelor's degree in English Lit, and then a few years later got his master's degree. And after he graduated, he wrote a novel, but decided that he was not a very good writer, and so had to come up with something else to do.
And like off that, his like failure in writing, he called his dark year. And this put him into a bookstore in New York where he came across some books written by Pavlov and Watson, and this really sparked his like interest in psychology, which caused him to enroll in Harvard to study a little bit more about psychology.
And he was in the psychology department too, right?
Correct. Yeah. There he found a mentor, William Kosher. He found like similar like things within him that like he really like wanted. Like they were both like kind of stubborn, like knew what they wanted and like did what they wanted situation. And so they like William Kosher studied animal behavior as like a whole, and this is like something Skinner wanted to do, and so they kind of worked together on that.
And Skinner wanted to relate behaviors to conditions, and so he kind of used Kosher as a mentor in his work with behaviors as a whole, to fuel his study of behavior and conditions. And it's actually while he was at Harvard when he built the operant conditioning chamber, which became known as a Skinner box. And he used it to condition animals to do different behaviors. And it helped him develop his behavior conditioning theories. And so he'd put an animal in this box and train it to perform in response to a stimuli that was provided in the box. And so it was only receiving like the one stimuli that was given to them. And that kind of helped him generate his operant conditioning and reinforcement theories and those things.
It is in this also that he found reinforcement was necessary.
Yeah. And they called him the father of operant conditioning too. And so it was like all of this that was when he learned that behaviors can be strengthened by reinforcement, which I think what you were saying, Katie.
Yeah.
And he kind of developed all of that and the term operant conditioning because the behaviors that he was looking at, they're operating on the environment to achieve a goal, and that's kind of how he got operant conditioning from that. And the behaviors and stuff that he was looking at were very voluntary behaviors, and they were goal-oriented and controlled by a consequence, and so that's how he kind of shaped them in different animals.
He started to work with pigeons. They would peck at a disc to receive food, and once they like learned, like they'd start doing it more and more. Really like got the idea, which is like what he was going for. And then right around the time of like World War II, he was training pigeons for bombing runs, which we looked up, and it's the part of the flight that begins with the approach to the target. And after that, we were kind of like, why do you need pigeons? It ended up getting like canceled.
Probably because it doesn't seem like it would be very useful to have a pigeon leading your bomber plane into the war. But he did because it got canceled, he did end up training those pigeons to play ping pong somehow, which would be interesting to see, a pigeon playing ping pong.
Definitely.
And he kind of developed his reinforcement theory from all of this work with the pigeons, especially, were his favorite animals to work with. And he came to the conclusion that there are 3 different types of reinforcement. There's positive and negative reinforcement, and then kind of opposing that, there's punishment. And so with positive reinforcement, you're rewarding a behavior. If the animal pecks this disc, and that's what you're trying to train this pigeon to do, is peck a disc, then when they do it, he would give them food, and that would strengthen the behavior, and they were more likely to peck at this disc. But he wouldn't give them any food until they pecked the disc, and so it's kind of borderline. I think today would have animal rights people kind of up in arms. They wouldn't be very happy about how he ran his experiments.
And off of the positive reinforcement, there's negative reinforcement. So instead of receiving an award, an unpleasant stimuli or punishment, is taken away when the behavior is performed. So it's kind of the exact opposite of positive.
Yeah, it works in the same way as the positive reinforcement to strengthen the behavior, though. It's just I know I don't know if you read this, but that they would electrocute this box, and it would stop electrocuting the pigeon when they pecked the disc. And so then it's removing this negative stimuli from the pigeon's environment when they do this certain behavior. But just like the positive reinforcement, his experiments with it were kind of cruel to the pigeons.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's punishment, which instead of really strengthening the behavior, it tends to weaken the behavior. And it really does the opposite of the reinforcement. So instead of building up, you're tearing down basically with the punishments.
Yeah. And I saw that it's really hard to tell the difference between a negative reinforcement and a punishment, especially when you are giving a negative reinforcement or a punishment, because with the negative reinforcement, you're removing a reward or inflicting something unpleasant, and so it can be hard to tell when what you're doing is negative reinforcement and when it is punishment, and that makes it somewhat complicated because negative reinforcement strengthens behaviors, and the punishment will weaken them. And since it's sometimes hard to tell the difference, it can also then be hard to actually be strengthening a behavior when you want it to be strengthened, because you could actually be doing something that's punishment and that will weaken it and suppress the behavior, and eventually it will come back, is one thing that they looked at. I also saw that as his own children, because he had 2 daughters, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
As they became school age, that's kind of when he became interested in applying his theories to the education field and kind of learning more about all of that. Did you?
Yeah. So off of what he did with his children, he made a machine that helped a broad range of children learn, and off of his findings on that, he wrote The Technology of Teaching,
mm-hmm.
which he later dedicated to his English teacher back from high school, Miss Graves. And the dedication came from something an interaction they had. He pretty much told her she was wrong in what she was doing, and he went to the library later and started reading some of Bacon's work. And this helped him later in a lot of his scientific stuff.
Yeah, and he read the work to try and he was trying to prove that he was right?
Yeah. Correct.
And I know the things that he had read, especially dealing with Bacon's inductive method, became helpful with the machine he made that helped teach lots of children, his teaching machine, that he used it to study learning, and it administered a programmed instruction and then questions and rewards to the students. So I know that Miss Graves and arguing with her kind of helped him when he was then developing his teaching machine and studying education and psychology. I think from everything he did, his reinforcement theories are probably the most influential of all of his work, of the operant conditioning chamber and his education work. The reinforcement theory really plays a big part in how we treat children and help them learn, don't you think?
Yeah, and I also know that his theories have kind of like fallen out of like the popular eye.
Yeah.
Even though I feel like they're like what we most commonly would see in the education setting.
I feel like to some extent they just aren't thought about like they were. I mean, you use negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement and punishment all the time with kids. You just don't really think about what you're doing and where it came from, and like that these theories, the reinforcement theories, came from someone, because you have to use things like that with the kids to help them learn and to help them learn how they're supposed to behave in different situations. So I don't know that they fell out of favor as much as like just aren't thought about as much. It's interesting to think about. But it's definitely, I would say, his most influential work, wouldn't you?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.